noches a todas y a todos y bienvenidos a esta fiesta de la discrepancia. Tenemos la fortuna de poder conversar con Wendy Brown sobre la vida sin valores. Ella acaba de publicar un libro en el que aborda este tema llamado Tiempos nihilistas, que probablemente debería ser uno de los primeros argumentos de los que podamos conversar. En este libro ella reflexiona con Max Weber acerca de cosas que tienen mucho que ver con el mundo en el que vivimos, puesto que en el momento en el que él dio las conferencias a las que se refiere sobre la política, la ciencia, en ese momento la democracia estaba perdiendo su prestigio y empezaban a verse en el horizonte los regímenes totalitarios que marcaron el siglo XX. Así que con esos paralelismos que podemos figurarnos, me gustaría, Wendy, que lo primero que hicieras fuera hablarnos de cómo Max Weber deconstruye los valores en ese proceso de desencanto del mundo en el que la religión ha sido superada y la ciencia tampoco acaba de dar respuestas.
Thank you. I'll answer your question in just a moment.
Yes.
I first just want to say what a pleasure it is to be in Madrid. I want to offer a special thanks to the extraordinary organizers of this conference, to Jesús for being willing to talk with me tonight, and to my comrades who are standing up against the genocide in Palestine. To your question. Max Weber is an unlikely ally for the left, and yet, for me, he's absolutely indispensable. He's indispensable in part because he has an enormously rich theory of power. He's indispensable in part because even though we widely understand him to be an advocate of science in its German sense, but also in its hard science sense, the belief that science delivered facts about the world, and that science was, for him, the framework for developing knowledge. At the same time, what Weber understood profoundly was that science and the formulation of philosophical reason, that was one of its important cousins, was emptying the world of meaning. Why? What Weber understood was that as science grew in modernity, as the valorization of reason developed in modernity, God and the authority of religion more generally would wane. This was important for him because he understood that in the West, monotheism, since the development of Christianity, had organized the production and the securing of values. What this means is that value itself, the values that we use to orient ourselves in the world, to make decisions, to make judgments, but also the very value of truth, was in danger. Why? Because when science begins to displace reason, displace God and religion, what happens is that you get ever-growing accounts of the mechanisms by which things work. What science, what reason offers us, is a more and more powerful way of understanding how things work, but not what their value is. And if science displaces religious authority, which is how Weber understood modernity, that's for him the basic story of modernity, when that happens, the result is a world that has more and more knowledge and less meaning, more and more facticity and less understanding of what and how to value what we know. Now, just to conclude, what Weber understood was that that condition was the one that we call nihilism. Not nihilism in the sense of punk or ennui or despair, but nihilism as a world more and more emptied of meaning, more and more emptied of value. But he also knew that nihilism had its own way of messing with value, not just voiding it, not just depleting the world of value, but also proliferating value, turning value into a cheap thing, an instrumentalizable thing, a thing that we use for branding, a thing that we use for all kinds of commercial purposes, a thing that politicians use to mobilize voters, even when they themselves don't even believe the values that they're advocating. So the problem that Weber gives us is that on the one hand, there's less and less ground in our world for knowing how to value things and what things really mean, what their worth is. And on the other hand, value becomes this cheap and tawdry thing that everybody uses and deploys and uses to cover up a will to power and uses to cover up a will to profit. Think about greenwashing, think about pinkwashing, think about all the ways that values get deployed today. Weber seriously believed that there was a way through this. It's not an easy one, but above all, it involves human beings recognizing that we are the source of value. Not God, not nature, not facts, not science, not technology, not knowledge. Human beings produce value, and we have to argue about it and deliberate about it and pursue it as a way of organizing the world in what we take to be just or equitable or democratic or decent or sustainable ways. And he knew that was an enormous human undertaking at the end of this period we call modernity, but that's the one he took to be before us in the 20th century. He was writing right at the turn of the century. Actually, he was writing these lectures, as you say, right at the end of World War I. And he knew that that crisis of values was part of what he was witnessing in Europe at that time, and was arguing ferociously in these lectures for us to take the production of value, the very crafting of value, as the most serious project in politics that we could possibly undertake. That was long-winded, sorry.
Bueno, pero yo creo que era también necesario. A mí me gustaría, porque da la impresión de que todo este proceso que él avanza ocurre en un momento en el que todo el mundo está invocando los valores de la Ilustración todavía, y él parece que los está de alguna manera haciendo minucias, ¿no? Haciendo trozos pequeños, ¿no? Que está devaluando, digamos, esos valores de la Ilustración. Y curiosamente tú en estos momentos llamas la atención sobre ese proceso en un momento en el que esos valores también están impugnados, ¿no? Tenemos ahora mismo una relación complicada con los valores de la Ilustración. Tiene mucho que ver con la crisis actual de las democracias, ¿no? Y me gustaría que hablaras un poco de esta paradoja, ¿no? De cuál es nuestra relación real con ese mundo que todavía tenemos un poco mitificado de la Ilustración, en un momento en el que todo parece ser una crisis de lo que supuso ese momento.
I think I understand your question, but I'm going to ask you to make sure. You're saying that Weber understood the crisis of the Enlightenment was part of the predicament of his problem in the interwar period, and we today see a crisis of truth, of facts, of the value of. I assume you're also talking about Enlightenment values like reason and accountability and peace. And I'm just thinking about what you're putting in the Enlightenment box here, that we also are facing that kind of a crisis, even though it's a different one than the one he...
Eso es.
Okay, yes, I have it? Okay. So, for Weber, to start there and then come to the contemporary question, the way to address this crisis was to separate politics from the production of knowledge, to understand that politics was almost a pure value realm, and production and dissemination of knowledge, he was really focused on the universities, was a realm of science. And it's not that he didn't think there was some crossover, but he wanted a moat between those as a way not to recover the Enlightenment promise, but to sustain the promise of science to deliver a kind of truth, a truth about how things work, and to sustain the Enlightenment promise of, let's call it democracy, even though it's not an Enlightenment promise, but we'll just be loose for a second, that human beings should be able to freely think and say what they think, and also pursue the political life together that they believe in. So the way to get through this predicament of modernity that he identified was to get these two realms separated. Today, I would say the crisis Weber identified appears kind of like a little baby thing compared to ours. It's not just that we have a proliferation of values on the one hand and a certain nihilistic devaluation of truth on the other hand. The very idea of truth is radically in crisis. It's deployed all the time. Everybody claims to have it or claims to be asserting it. But when you have so many contesting truths, especially in politics, and so many truths that are manifestly not true, amped up, obviously, by new technologies, especially in media, but in a number of other zones as well, the question of how to secure a domain of truth in the knowledge realm is a more serious one. But the other thing that Weber couldn't think through is what we've done to the problem of facts and truth since Weber. And here I just invoke a post-structuralist turn, a feminist turn, a series of transformations of knowledge that have deeply problematized the idea that what universities can promote is the order of facts that you need in order to then make some decision about what your values are or what things mean. Because what all of the mid-century to late 20th century transformations of knowledge did for us was help us remember what Nietzsche had taught in the previous century, namely, there is no uninterpreted fact. There are accounts, there are perspectives, That doesn't make everything relative. That doesn't make the problem of the fact go away, but no fact speaks for itself. We speak it in an order of facticity and in a project of a narrative or a framing. So we have that problem. We also, even the scientists recognize, the hard scientists recognize now that they narrate. They don't simply deploy facts. And we also probably wouldn't go along with Weber in the idea that values don't shape our ways of understanding facts. So his effort to build a big moat doesn't help us with our predicament. It also doesn't help us with our predicament entirely in politics, where in political life we are constantly having to navigate not just clashes of values, but clashes of accounts of the world, supposedly rooted in truth, and whether you're on the left or the right, what I would call a kind of frantic reach for a ground of truth, a foundation of truth for your position. Here, I would just say, I think Weber might be a little more helpful because what he wants to suggest in his time that we might bring forward to our time is that we reckon with the fact, and it's a hard reckoning. It's a really hard reckoning. We reckon with the fact that our narratives, which are informed by values, are contingent. That is, contestable. They are not absolute. They are not absolutely right. I begin with an affirmation of a fact I want to insist on, a genocide in Palestine, of which I am critical. But I know that is also a position informed by a set of values, informed certainly by a historical account, certainly by a set of factual, empirical studies, certainly by a challenge to a set of frameworks that would deny this. But at the same time, I know that the argument that I want to make, the position I want to take up, is contestable. And we hate that. We want our position to be absolutely true, whether it's God's truth or natural truth or factual truth or scientific truth. We want our position to be absolutely true. The hard challenge that we are getting from Nietzsche, from Dostoevsky, from Tolstoy, from Weber, the whole tradition of people thinking about the problematic of truth and value in late modernity, is that you don't get to have that. You have to become a grown-up. You have to accept that the position you are taking is informed by a passionate conviction, hopefully also by a set of accounts, a set of serious work, study, knowledge, and so forth, but it is finally contestable. And that's the human world. We are human beings who interpret, who develop values, who develop narratives, and they aren't ever final. Nobody's going to like that. You don't have to clap.
Es muy interesante todo lo que estás comentando y me lleva a una frase que hablas en el libro de Weber, que él decía que, sobre todo referido a la academia, no podemos decidir qué valores son los correctos. Pero yo creo que hay una cierta paradoja tanto en el mundo de la política como en el mundo de la academia hoy, y es que de alguna manera se está haciendo una presión con determinados valores en un momento en que además la sociedad está muy polarizada y hay parte de la sociedad que no admite unos valores y otra parte otros, ¿no? Y a mí me gustaría que me hablaras de esa contradicción, ¿no? ¿Por qué tenemos que ser conscientes de lo contingente, de lo que creemos verdad? Tenemos que ser humildes con nuestra posición en el mundo y a la vez hay una convicción tan grande de que desde la academia o desde la política hay unos valores que son intocables. ¿Cómo se llega a ese acuerdo? A mí me gustaría que me hablaras de cómo se llega a ese acuerdo de esos valores. ¿Quién elige esos valores?
Great. Okay. So now we're going to get serious about the separation between the university and political life. This is where I will follow Weber a little bit and then depart from him again. Weber separated them absolutely. University is a domain for learning and reflecting. You can reflect on values, but only analytically. You should never promulgate them. And he really did believe they could be detached from facts. We don't believe that. Politics was the realm of struggle. Politics is the realm where you fight for your values. And for him, it's a never-ending fight. That's the other bad news I'm bringing to you tonight. It's not like we finally get there and it's done. It's a never-ending struggle. But it's a never-ending struggle precisely because values, even if they didn't have this nihilistic form of being cheap and proliferating and tawdry and mobilized by irresponsible politicians for all kinds of bad stuff, even if they didn't have that quality, there would still be a big struggle over them. And Weber himself was a very conservative German nationalist, statist, and he was scolding his socialist students in part, but he was also saying that he understood his own values to be contingent and theirs as well, and that was one of the fundamental clashes of his time between socialism and that kind of conservatism. Not too much liberalism. Now, the part of this I want us to take seriously is that university spaces, rapidly shrinking as a domain for seriously considering the various kinds of entailments of realms of value, seriously shrinking as a place to consider how facts are made, constructed, organized, deconstructed. Universities are a place for that kind of thinking. They are a place for us to be undergoing challenges to, questions about, things we think we believe. That's a good place for this. You're not at risk of losing your life for having those thoughts. In a university, you're not at risk of coercion if the space is actually one in which one accepts that learning includes learning about the order of values you think you hold dear, whether they are religious or secular, or whether they are about another world is possible, or the 50s would be a better time to go back to. All of that, we can have those arguments, we can have that thinking, we can wrestle with what he called inconvenient facts. And by that he meant facts that really mess up your analysis, that really problematize what you want to believe. That's a good place for that. But the political realm is a terrible place for that. Why? Because you are fighting to make the world that you want to bring into being with every inch of your existence. You are fighting to make that world come into being. That is not a place to pause and deconstruct and interpret and be radically unsure and uncertain and open. And so I think that distinction between a place and a space and a way of being that is open, that is willing to contest yourself and learn more and rethink and be transformed by what you're learning, belongs in that place. And for the most part, there are moments of that in politics. We've all had them, you know, where you're learning on the job, as it were, and you're being transformed to some degree by what you're struggling for or what you're struggling against. But that's the place where you fight. And so the second distinction Weber makes between the knowledge domain and the political domain, the first one is facts, the other's values. But the second one he makes is one is relatively peaceful, not absolutely, but relatively peaceful, and the other one is struggle, it's power, and its ultimate currency, he reminds us, is violence. So that is not the place to call meaning into question and call every category and term and element of your convictions into question. Now, the last thing I want to say here is that to update Weber a little bit, Stuart Hall was always just brilliant on this topic. The way he put it is, in the domain of theory or knowledge, our task is to make meaning slide. And he was, of course, drawing on the idea of the sliding signifier, but if you don't know what that means, it doesn't matter. What he was suggesting was that what happens in the domain of, he called it theory, I just call it knowledge more generally, is that you're constantly taking what you think of a fact means or stands for and troubling it, messing with it a little bit, rethinking it, recrafting it. You don't want to do that at the very end of your dissertation work because you got to get done, but you do that when you're in the midst of learning and thinking, and we do that as teachers. We trouble things. We make meaning slide. In the political domain, Stuart Hall said, the project is to arrest the slide of meaning. What did he mean? That you, instead of saying, well, we're not really sure what we mean by reproductive freedom. I mean, let's take apart reproductive and let's take apart freedom and really think about them. That is a great thing to do over there in that first domain. Think really hard about freedom. What would it really mean to have freedom? And what does it mean to attach reproduction to freedom and freedom to reproduction? It's a kind of wild idea once you really start thinking about it. But in politics, we just have to fucking fight for it. We have to have reproductive freedom all the way down, and we know that. But if we keep going back to the university to think through what it means, we might rethink who needs it? What kind of gender needs it? What are the gender politics today that make reproductive freedom different than they appeared to us 10 years ago, 20 years ago, and certainly 100 years ago? And how might it expand to include not just the right to do what you want with your own body, but the right to not have be done to your body what could be done, for example, under colonialism, where experiments on women's body have always been rampant, and on poor people, where forced sterilization is still a practice. So there is a domain for thinking all of these problems through, but in the political domain, what Stuart Hall said is you arrest the slide of meaning. So one domain you make it slide, the other one you arrest it. If you don't want Weber, take Stuart Hall, he's much cooler, and you can just have those two code words.
Me gustaría también, ya que citabas esta frase, preguntarte si el significado en algunas ocasiones no se ha deslizado demasiado lejos, porque todos hemos visto que la lucha política ha entrado en las universidades. Hemos visto las enormes manifestaciones contra la guerra en Gaza, los grandes debates del antisemitismo que han producido, e incluso hemos visto a las responsables de las principales universidades rindiendo cuentas en el Parlamento en Estados Unidos. De alguna manera, esa invocación que tú llevas hacia la lucha política fuera de las aulas, es imposible mantenerla dentro de las aulas, y desde ese punto no sería una enorme paradoja querer hacer una separación que ya parece imposible, porque hay un presupuesto de valores y de acción política a los que responden? Es decir, ¿no estás hablando de una mutación de la academia en el mundo actual?
Really important question. Thank you, Jesus. Okay, two parts to the answer. First, we do have to remember that since we're now talking about universities, they're complex spaces. They're classrooms. They're open civic or civil spaces. In many cases, there are also living spaces, dorms. And each of these, in my view, has to have a somewhat different code for the question of what happens in them. In those civic or civil spaces, they're akin to public squares. And the argument that some have made that they have to be safe spaces and contain no speech that you don't want to hear seems to me to confuse that civic or open space with the home. There are things I don't want to hear in my home, and I may refuse to hear in my home by removing the source of them, whether it's a human or whether it's a radio program or something else. But that's a prerogative, whether your home is a tiny tent or a little room or something a bit more spacious. So there's home versus civic space, but there's also civic space versus classroom. I am a strong advocate of free speech in open spaces. It's a complicated term. It's one of those terms we have to take apart in the classroom. But I'll just say in general, I think people ought to be able to say just about anything they want to say, with the limits being always incitations to certain forms of violence or damage. I think people ought to be able to do that. They are not safe spaces emotionally. They just aren't. You can leave them, but you can't demand that you only hear what you feel safe enough to hear, what you want to hear. You can't do that in a public life. The classroom is a different matter. It's not so much about safety as accountability of speech. If I am teaching a text, let's say I'm teaching Plato, and a student comes in and says, today I want to talk about fennel. I'm going to say, no, we're talking about Plato. Plato is our text, unless they can make a connection. But if they just say, no, I don't want to talk about Plato. Plato's not the text that I want to talk about. I want to talk about fennel. That's out of order. A classroom is a space where you are trying to know something together, and in my view, somebody has to be in charge. Now, I'm going to get to the contestable moment in a second. The simpler version of this is that if a student says 2 + 2 is 7, I'm not going to say, okay, you got a right to say that. That's inappropriate in a classroom. You can say it in this space and you can say it in your home. So I think we need to recognize what so few university administrators and trustees and politicians recognize, which is that universities are generally consisting of these complex differences in domain. They're miniature cities often, where there are homes, places where people live, where there are workers, where there are faculty, where there are students, where there are public spaces, and where there are educational spaces. So we need differences. Now, the hard question today: what happens when you have a teacher who insists on one particular framing of a political problem, whether it's race or Palestine or capitalism or neoliberalism or gender or reproductive politics or cosmology or philosophy of science or something else? What happens when you want to contest that? In my view, I think it's really important to be able to contest those things, either as a student contesting a teacher's pedagogy or a teacher's curriculum, but it has to be done responsibly, and it has to be done in such a way that there's a possible answer to it, not just a shut it down. On the other hand, my own view is that as teachers, we have to be brave enough to accept that. And I'm afraid I don't experience very many of my colleagues as adequately brave in that regard. But maybe we'll get braver because we are not just temporarily, I think, in difficult political times. We're in the 21st century. We have to get stronger. We have to get braver. We have to become better pedagogues.
¿Se podría entender ese tipo de circunstancias como un ataque a la libertad?
I'm sorry, I forgot to put my earpiece in and I was looking for it, so I didn't even listen to a question I could have understood in Spanish because it was so brief. Go ahead.
Sí. ¿Se podrían entender este tipo de circunstancias como ataques a la libertad?
The moment when a student tries to shut down a...
O el momento en...
Yep, hold on. See, what happens is if I keep it in, I start hearing myself in
O también
Spanish.
el momento en el que hay una presión sobre algún tema, una cancelación en marcha. Todos hemos visto ese tipo de procesos que tienen que ver, pues eso, con los espacios seguros, con determinadas cosas que desaparecen del currículum. Quiero decir, ¿eso es un ataque a la libertad también dentro del aula?
You know, maybe it's a problematization of freedom. I guess when I was faulting us as teachers a few minutes ago for not standing up to the moment, I offered one example. But what I want to say here is, you know, when a student demands a safe space, I don't think the answer is yes or no. The answer is, let's sit down and talk about what a safe space is and why you would ask for it here. When a student demands a Zionist curriculum or an anti-Zionist curriculum or a feminist curriculum or a non-feminist curriculum from a teacher who's offering the opposite, those are what we call teachable moments. Those are moments to open up the conversation and say, demands, political demands, don't belong here. What does belong here is a difficult conversation about not just what's happening in the world, but what you're asking of knowledge, what you're asking of teaching, what you're asking of your fellow students. Let's have that conversation. And it's very hard to do, but I come from a university in California, Berkeley, where we've been having to do that for decades. So you do learn to do it over time if you're willing. You learn to take not just the thoughtful, passionate political convictions flying at you as a moment to begin to open up a conversation, but even the crazies. When I say I've been learning to do it for decades, I mostly teach dead white men. Dead white men have not been attractive to undergraduates in my university for a very long time. And they're always asking why we are studying dead white men. And some of them, you know, march on me and protest it and demand that we read anything but dead white men. And I have to be able to work with them on the question of why it's worth reading these people and how we might read them so that we're not propagandized by them, so we understand our world, more richly and more deeply than we would if we just put them in the category of dead white men. I see that the emergency vehicles don't like this discourse, so let's have a new one.
Entre los estudios que tú has hecho sobre las raíces del nihilismo, en el que colocas, digamos, este debate, los más llamativos son los que has hecho sobre la ideología neoliberal, el pensamiento conservador, podemos llamarlo, o liberal económicamente. A mí me gustaría saber, puesto que tú antes lo has citado, que la posibilidad en la que Weber cae es que tanto en un extremo, en la izquierda, como en el otro, en la derecha, hay que pensar que cada uno está buscando las bases de sus valores, ¿no? Si concibes que está descompensado en estos momentos, ¿cómo se aceptan las críticas desde el punto de vista que estábamos hablando ahora, o otras críticas que vienen desde el lado más conservador? En Estados Unidos, además ahora en el proceso electoral, todo esto se está viviendo, se están prohibiendo libros, etcétera. Hay un montón de problemas, digamos, relativos a esto. ¿Crees que la academia trata con ecuanimidad los problemas de un lado y del otro? ¿O tiene, digamos, el tablero está un poco torcido a favor del pensamiento progresista?
So historically, since really World War II, it has been weighted toward the progressive side. It's been for many reasons in the U.S., not least because of what was our once really extraordinary public university system, which we've dismantled under neoliberalism. But what that system did was bring many, many working class people into intellectual life, because public universities in the US after World War II were ubiquitous, they were large, they offered an excellent education, and they were free. And that combination meant access by classes that prior to that time and since about 2000 have not had access. So filling the university with working class individuals who then went on to become professors often meant a fairly progressive professorship coming out of that. However, what I want to suggest now is that universities have found themselves so on the defensive about what they imagine to be their bad reputation as progressive bastions, and they have found themselves so on the defensive in relation to left student demands that they think add to that bad reputation, and they don't know how to fight the attacks by the right on their curriculums and on their professoriate. So now I would suggest, Jesus, that what's actually happening is more and more universities are trying really hard to tilt toward the center to prove that they're not bastions of left intellectual life. This is coming primarily from administrators and trustees, but it's also coming from some of the more conservative social sciences, and it's certainly coming from, well, I'll just leave it at that. So it's not just a story of, we're a bunch of lefties, we occupied the university, the right has figured that out, and now they're coming after us and revealing and exposing just how imbalanced we are. There's something more subtle going on in the politics of university life in relationship to politics. But what I've been insisting on, I'll just end my answer to your question with this. What I've been insisting on is that I think we on the left would be better off if we defeated that attack from the right by not being so predictable, by not actually advocating, I'm coming back to Weber here, a set of values in the classroom, by not promulgating certain kinds of things, but by teaching widely and broadly and intelligently, and counting on students to be able to arrive at smart judgments by being well educated rather than by being inculcated. So I'm flipping now back to the other side of your question. I am faulting us on the left a bit for having imagined for some decades, I think this is especially true in what we call the humanities, is often called the human sciences in Europe. I think we have made a mistake in believing that what we were there to do was hold up a certain set of values, as opposed to give students deep and profound educations, and guiding them in the project of arriving at judgments, attributing meaning, deciding values after and through their education, rather than having those things driven by us.
Esto es muy interesante porque siempre además tiene que, entiendo, que hallarse un encuentro, ¿no? Y lógicamente desde una posición como la que tú defiendes, desde la izquierda, hay veces que se puede ver un poco minusvalorada la opción contraria. Y viene esto a cuento porque hace muy poco hemos leído aquí en la prensa en España, los compañeros del País hicieron una entrevista a Nick Cave, al cantante, en el que había una frase suya que ha llamado mucho la atención, porque decía que él veía una configuración predeterminada de mucha gente para derribarlo todo, que él no estaba de acuerdo y que desde ese punto de vista se sentía un poco conservador, porque no tenía esa pulsión de derribarlo. Y ha causado un gran revuelo. Nick Cave dice que es conservador. A mí me gustaría saber si esto que estabas tú diciendo ahora casa bien con un diálogo con la otra parte, es decir, encontrar el camino de los estudiantes a través de un encuentro dialéctico, evidentemente, y no de para sacarlo del cajón de la política, donde es más la lucha, ¿no?
You know, it's hard. When you're young, I mean, when I was young, I really wanted a set of convictions that were unshakable, that were without contradiction, without paradox, they were unproblematic. And I understand that impulse, but what I'm suggesting is precisely that allowing one's values to be intersected by other values. There is no better way to become a better thinker. I'm not saying you take everything on, you end up in the center. That's not my point. I feel like I have become a more thoughtful member of the left, a more thoughtful feminist, a more thoughtful anti-racist and anti-colonial thinker by virtue of allowing myself to be educated and challenged by readings, by interlocutors who are brilliant, but not on my team. And that double criteria is essential. You can't just be not on my team. If you're going to say stupid stuff, I'm not going to learn. But you can't just be brilliant and stay on your own team. I mean, that's my pedagogy and that's my way of developing as a thinker. Let me give you an example, a benign one because it's not in the present and I don't have to pick on anyone. Edmund Burke, Max Weber, Schmidt, these are no friends of the left. Every one of them has something we need. Every one of them has a thought that we won't think easily from where we sit. And you know, when the students and I read Burke together, and we see his attachment to tradition and to what he calls the rhythms of tradition, or what he offers as a critique of a temperament or an appetite for constant change. At first, any left student is going to hate it, and then if you dwell in it for a little while and you think about what is that appetite for constant change, what is that tear it all down impulse, what is that appetite for destruction or for constant can we really live in that? Is that really sustainable, or do we need to think it a little differently? I could give other examples, but what I'm suggesting is that this allowing yourself to be intersected by really profound thinking, really profound and accountable thinking that you don't necessarily agree with, nothing makes you a better thinker.
Estaba justo recordando que al final de tu libro hay una página en la que citas a la vez a Carl Schmitt, a Lenin, y estás hablando precisamente de la búsqueda, la salida de una solución para tratar de encontrar cuáles son los valores que deben ponerse en juego en el mundo educativo, sobre todo, ¿no? Y supongo que como consecuencia alguna relación tendría con lo que ocurra en el futuro en el mundo político, donde tampoco nos vendría mal. Me gustaría que hablaras un poco de esta parte final del libro, de cómo es esa construcción de valores, cómo evitar el peligro que Weber también decía de no convertir la enseñanza en una predicación, cómo hay que sortear esos abismos. Estabas un poco hablando de ello, pero me gustaría que lo concretaras como tú lo haces en el libro, que me parece que es un buen cierre de todo el diálogo que mantienes con Max Weber.
Thank you. One of my problems at this point in life is I don't remember what I've written, so I appreciate that you found something beautiful in there, but I don't remember it, but I'm going to try to make something up right now. Look.
Inventa.
Weber was really insistent that we are teachers, not preachers. And even in the political realm, what he insisted is that we are political actors, not religionists. This is his anti-religion view, but the reason that he was so stern in both dimensions is that he felt, to use the power of the pulpit was an irresponsible power in the classroom. It demanded followers rather than thinkers, and it also demanded that it pretended that the power, the enormous power that teachers have, wasn't consequential and didn't need to be used responsibly. In the political realm, he worried a lot about religion, because he thought that if you were confusing political values with a religious table of values, there was a very serious danger. And that danger was that you would imagine that any means to an end politically was okay, because you were headed for the promised land. And he knew that was very dangerous. He knew that's when violence would unfold. That when there is that religious impulse to, when there is a religious draping over a set of political values, instead of being able to handle the difference, the diversity, the discussion, the deliberation, the contestation, but also instead of being responsible with power and reckoning at every turn with the fact that in politics, actions are often taken whose consequences you can't know, but you have to at least try to predict. You have to at least try to predict, because there's no other way to be a responsible political actor. So if you're a religious zealot in politics, and he thought you could be a religious zealot without being formally religious. You could be a religious zealot on the right. You could be a religious zealot on the left. If you just thought your truth was absolute and any means to an end was acceptable, the result would be bloodbaths, always. So in both cases, I don't know why I'm ending here, because I can't remember what I wrote at the end. In both cases, he was warning against what he took to be the irresponsibility of the church either of religion, but he called it the church, either inside the classroom or in the political realm. He thought that church had its own place in church, and that we secularists, we, in his case, 20th century folk, and in our case, 21st century folk, had to recognize we're humans, we're full of power, we build incredible systems of power, we build worlds out of that capacity, and it is in our hands to be responsible for our decisions, our actions, our words, our collective and collaborative projects, and that's what politics is, and also that's what knowledge or university life is, and that in both cases it required consummate responsibility, passion, knowledge, devotion, but above all, reckoning with the fact that it's us, it's humans. It's not God, it's not nature, it's not foundational, it's not coming from somewhere else, that we make this world. And where I depart from Weber is our task now is to make a much, much better world than this one. Thanks.
Muy bien, para ir terminando, yo creo que estamos ya prácticamente en el tiempo. Me gustaría preguntarte algunos de los valores que tú crees que en este momento son más relevantes. Antes hablábamos, antes de entrar, un poco de algunos, y uno de ellos que a mí me ha gustado, porque yo creo que en el momento en el que vivimos ahora de soluciones fáciles, de populismos simplones, la complejidad, la búsqueda de la complejidad podría ser uno, pero me gustaría que al menos 2, 3 más que tú creas que debemos preservar para todos.
Oh my God. Okay.
Not preacher.
No, thank you. I mean, your questions are absolutely wonderful, and I'm really grateful to you. They're really thoughtful. They're really great. Look, this is not the moment to lay out my whole vision for what I think the left ought to be doing and pursuing in political life. We can have a whole other conversation about that. But I will say that I'll just offer one for each domain, the knowledge domain and the political domain. In politics, nothing is more important now, I think, than reckoning with the enormous fragility of the world, both human and non-human life, and the failure in modernity, particularly through capitalism, to reckon with that fragility has brought us to the brink. It's brought us to the brink of continued existence for both human and non-human life, and certainly for continued thriving for the creatures, human and non-human, who are already on this planet. So reckoning with that fragility, and at the same time recognizing that what doesn't protect fragility and life thriving are markets left to their own devices, whether markets for anything left to their own devices will not protect that fragility. So for that, what we need is politics that does appreciate just how endangered we are now, all the life on the world, and what must be undertaken to bring us back from that brink, whether it's containing capitalism and markets, or whether it's transforming and developing a successor to it. In the domain of knowledge, I think what I've already expressed is the importance of the value of openness, fearlessness, deep curiosity, relentlessness in willingness to rethink certain projects and problems and convictions. And I guess I would just add this about, since we've been talking about university life, the importance of not allowing the current organization of the disciplines to set the agendas for knowledge. because those organizations haven't always set the best agendas. They've done something weird. It's another conversation for another time. They've invested themselves more in methodologies than in problems, and they've invested themselves now through neoliberalism. Only time I've said it all night. More in the entrepreneurial success of individuals in signifying and achieving things than in the actual value of the knowledge that we develop for the world. So in university life, I think there's nothing more important than, on the one hand, those values of openness, curiosity, depth, etc., but on the other hand, a commitment to thinking through what really matters, not what the disciplines and professions say matters. And in politics, bringing us back from the brink and beginning to make different forms of life that are more sustainable, more equal, more just, more fun, more joyous. Yes, those things too. They have to have more dancing and music, but they also have to have all of us in it. They have to be radically inclusive. Okay, now we're done.
O festivales de ideas en el anochecer. Muchísimas gracias, Wendy. Ha sido un gran placer. Muchas gracias por la conversación. Bienvenida.
Thank you.
Okay.
Muchas gracias a todos y a todas por asistir a esta primera jornada del Festival de las Ideas.